Genesis chapter 11, if you'll go ahead and turn there with me, we're going to begin this morning by reading Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 4. Again, Genesis chapter 11, beginning in verse 1, ending in verse 4. I'm reading out of the New American Standard Bible, the 1995 update. The writer says, "Now the whole earth used the same language and the same words. It came about as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of, hold on, let me make sure I pronounce this correctly, Shinar, okay? They found the plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said to one another, 'Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly.' And they used brick for stone, and they used tar for mortar. They said, 'Come, let us build for ourselves a city, and a tower whose top will reach into heaven. And let us make for ourselves a name, otherwise we'll be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth.'" As you may have noticed over the last several weeks in this study, Genesis is a book about beginnings. And as you consider this morning the chapter that we will be studying, Moses wrote down these various pieces of information as he was inspired, and he gave Israel the worldview that they need to live different from the nations. In Genesis, we have learned about a God, who He is, and why we can trust Him. That we live in a world crafted by Him, and that all are made in His image to bring about the flourishing of this world for His glory. We have learned so far that obedience to God is a key to usefulness, joy, and blessing. We have learned that all of us can trace our history back to Adam and Noah as well. But we have also learned who the real adversary is, right? We have witnessed Satan set against us, leading men into sin in various ways, whether it be pride or anger, violence, more of all to the destruction of us and our need for forgiveness. All of these things are the foundational pieces of information that as Moses, through the inspiration of God's Holy Spirit, penned these words, this was information that Israel, and in fact all of us, even today, need to understand and to make the right kind of decisions in our lives. All the things that we've witnessed thus far in our study of the book of Genesis are the basis for the rest of Scripture. The first thing that I want us to consider this morning as we read Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 4, the first thing that I wish for us to consider together is the rebellion. Again, Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 4. So we have picked up in our narrative after the flood, after the failure of Noah, and more specifically, the failure of his son, who? Ham. We see here from the passage that we've read together, these descendants of Noah and Ham They have common speech and are very much unified, which could have been, quite frankly, a tremendous asset to fulfill God's purposes. Do you remember the command that God gave to the children? Do you remember what God commanded Adam and then again Noah? That their responsibility was to do what? Be fruitful, multiply, and what? Fill the earth. So the question is, how is mankind utilizing the potential of which God has given them? We just talked about stewardship, right? There was stewardship at play here. God has granted mankind an intentional blessing that through their ability to reproduce, to multiply. Remember, they were multiplying at a rate that was greater than what we multiply even at to this day. The considerations we look back in the earlier chapters of Genesis were that the number of multiple births, triplets being born, would have been at a higher rate than we ever see today. So we witnessed the earth fill very, very quickly prior to the flood. And how did mankind use that potential prior to the flood? How did mankind steward that responsibility? What did we see? They turned it to evil, to the point where in Genesis chapter 6, every intention of man's heart was nothing but evil continually. So you would think, right, that after the flood that mankind would say, hey, we learned our lesson. Once again, man is commanded, Noah and his 3 sons are commanded to fill the earth. And yet, how does mankind steward the responsibility again? What are they doing here in Genesis chapter 11? To begin, let me remind you that these 2 chapters, chapter 10 and chapter 11, are not necessarily in chronological order. Chapter 11 is really and truly looking back in time to explain the table of nations, the disbursement of these various nations back in chapter 10. Remember, prior to this moment, there have been no nations, only cities, okay? So we are going to see what we saw written about in chapter 10 playing out on the big screen of text here in chapter 11. So remember that. What was so critical that it led all the nations to be divided according to their language, their land, and their people. The city and tower of what? Babel. We are introduced in this text to the time prior to such division, where again, let me remind you, everyone had the same language. And I love how the New American Standard says they used the same language and the same words. Now, how many of you have lived in America your entire life? How many of you have lived in Texas your entire life? How many of you have lived outside of Texas at certain points in your life? Do you realize that people in the Appalachian Mountains, even though they may speak the same language as you do not use the same words? Do you realize even where I grew up in Alabama, we speak the same language as the folks here in Texas, but we don't always use the same words. For instance, Ewans. Ewans is y'all plus 3. Used guys, yeah. I think they say pop some places. I don't say pop. What do I say? Coke. Everything's Coke. It doesn't matter, even if it's Dr. Pepper, it's still Coke. A bubbler, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the water fountain. Last week, not this weekend, but the prior weekend, people know that I'm from Alabama. People that I've worked with over the years, they know I'm from Alabama. But as an announcer, you can't sound like you're from Alabama. You can't cue up the mic and go, all right, y'all, we're here today for this here football game. I mean, I have to try to sound like I've got a decent IQ. But every once in a while, that Alabamian will slip out and people go, I recognize that. That's from Alabama. The point being, you can be of the same language and use different words. But folks, that tells you how unified these people were. Not only did they speak the same language, but they would use the same words to identify the various communication of which they spoke. These people also, according to what we've read here in these first 4 verses, they came to a very plain use of technology. The very first plain use of technology that we see on display here in Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 4, is they learned how to make what? Bricks. And what does it say the materials that they utilized to make such bricks? Does anybody see that in your text? They used brick from what? Stone. And they used what for mortar? Tar. Now, one of the things that was interesting when I was studying this is that there became this very plain tendency when bricks were made and buildings were built, that those who would build the bricks would etch the name of the person that was lord over them, or their particular leader. They would etch the name of that individual in the bricks. So then a building would be built in that person's name, which is quite interesting when you think about their thought process here in Genesis chapter 11. I want you to notice their reasoning. First, it says that they wanted to make what for themselves? A name. So it really wasn't enough to take upon for themselves the name of God any longer, was it? They wanted to have their own name. A name for themselves. They wanted the glory. So what is creeping into their hearts here, church? Pride, that's right. Is it wrong to want to leave a legacy? Not inherently wrong. I mean, one of the things I think about quite often is the legacy that I will leave behind as a minister of the gospel. What type of legacy will I leave? Nothing inherently wrong with that until pride becomes the central focus of such of a legacy. The second reason that I really see here in this text that they were going to go this route is they wanted to avoid something. What did they diligently want to avoid? What does it tell us? They wanted to avoid being scattered, or another word would be dispersed, scattered over the face of the whole earth. Now, on the surface, you may go, well, Jonathan, that's not that big of a problem. I really don't see anything too big of a problem with that. But the text is revealing some concerning things that is happening here within the hearts of these individuals. Notice what direction the people are moving in. Do you notice what direction the people are moving in? Eastward. Now, let me ask you, humanity migrating eastward. Do you remember God sent Adam and Eve which direction after the fall? East. Then on, east symbolizes moving further away from God. For example, Cain killed Abel, right? And Abel then begins to live where? Chapter 4 and verse 16, do you remember? East of Eden. So their journey is taking them further away from God. And more into rebellion. We're going to see this as this journey continues. One of the things that they are doing here as well, quite frankly, it's not a bad thing. They are finding an open place that seems good for home. But rather than obey God's command to fill, again, to fill, they decide to settle. That is, they try to gather themselves to create a place of life by their own power. You say, so what's the problem? The problem is that they are disobeying the divine mandate. Again, we said this already, but earlier, God had given them directions for them to be fruitful and multiply, specifically in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 28. Part of the command, remember, this was given to Adam. It was not given to Noah. The part of this command was not. Both shared a similar command to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, but one, Adam was told to subdue the earth. Remember, Noah was not told to subdue the earth. They were to use their dominion to bring about the development of the entire world for the glory of God. However, instead of filling the earth with God's glory, they united in one location to make a name for themselves. At the very core of this decision was the pride that you mentioned just a few moments ago. And a heart that was now beginning to further For now, if you just look or consider biblical archaeology, they will tell you that this place existed in the area of Shinar. Or we know that to be what modern day area? Does anybody know? Iraq. And further, let me make this very clear. I know I grew up seeing this as a kid. I would see these depictions of the Tower of Babel. And it would be this one circular tower going straight up. How many of you have seen a depiction like that, right? I don't believe that to be the case. What I have found in my study is that they were not just making one single tower to reach a tremendous height. They were making what people refer to as a ziggurat. Ziggurat. In other words, some of these buildings had various levels that led ultimately to the top, where there would be an altar. The ancient world, if you don't recognize this, the ancient world had a concept that gods dwelt upon mountains, high places. And so what seems to be happening here is somewhat of a religious act. They are making an access to the gods, a place where in their mind they picture heaven and earth at some place high enough, heaven and earth meet. But it's not like God, if you remember later on, He comes down on Mount Sinai. That's not what's happening here. This is mankind doing this for their own achievement and for their own glory. Now, let me ask you this. Is there anything inherently wrong with utilizing new technology? No, not inherently. You know what I've found, especially since COVID? So many times we have things that are good, and we tend to utilize them for what? Bad. I can remember a time where no church that I was a part of ever had a live feed. How many of you remember going to church when there was no such thing as a live stream? I remember a time where I would take VHS tapes out to shut-ins and sit in their living room and a Monday or Tuesday and watch my lesson with shut-ins over a VHS tape. Sometimes I had to take my own VCR with me and hope that their TV worked. Nowadays, just about everybody I know has access to some form of internet and live stream. Is that a good thing? Absolutely. If you're shut in this morning and you have no ability to be here, and your only connection with us is through that live stream, I say praise God for that ability for you. And how dare anybody look at that and go, oh, that's inherently sin. No, it is not inherently sinful. It is a good thing that can be what? Turned into a bad thing if it's utilized in a manner that makes it a bad thing. There are so many things in this world that God has allowed us to create that have goodness. And yet mankind takes that very same thing and uses it for evil. This ability to make bricks out of stone and use the tar for the mortar, who gave them that ability to do that? God did. Is there anything wrong with mankind collaborating together to create new things? No. In fact, I think that is my opinion is that's part of the great value that our modern civilization has to offer, is that people can get together, put their minds together, and create new things. Some of it scares me. I'm going to be honest with you. This AI stuff, it already frightens me a little bit. Those of you that have children, especially teenage children, are already seeing some of the dangers of AI even with their own children. The gathering of people together can bring about good things and allow you to have privileges that you may not have in smaller cities, smaller, more dispersed areas of population. For instance, if you lived in Montana, in the middle of Montana, out in the middle of nowhere, you may not have access to many of the modern advancements that we have right here in Houston. I always kid my children. Several weeks ago, we were down in South Alabama, and if you've ever driven to Gulf Shores, you can actually take this little shortcut there in Mississippi that will take you down south off of Interstate 10, and you can kind of go the back roads. And my children, we were going down these, and they were like, "Wow, this is beautiful, man. We'd love to live here." And I said, "No, you wouldn't." "What do you mean?" "Yeah, we'd love this. Look at all this. It's beautiful." I said, "There's not a Whataburger within 15 miles of where you're at right now. There's not a Taco Bell. There's not a whatever, Free Birds. You'd lose your mind because you've gotten so accustomed to what, class? All the convenience, right? Just right there in front of you." I got to be honest with you, though. I'm 47. At this point in my life, I wouldn't mind giving up some of those conveniences to have a little bit slower pace of life here in Houston. If we could just kind of tail it back just a little bit, you know. How many of you have driven on 45 recently? Yeah, when you drive on 45, it makes you wish you were back in some rural area of Alabama, I can promise you that. All right? So, again, not inherently wrong. But when our citizenship leads us to make wrong choices, as is in the case of Babel, what is good can cost us our relationship with God. And in this case, living in the city of Babel led these men and women to desire to make a name for themselves in this world. Now, do we ever make it a priority in our life to make a name for ourselves? We sure do. How many of you have ever said this? "I want my children to have it better than I had it"? How many of you, be honest? What do we mean by that? Tell me what we mean by that. Buy them everything they want, okay? Buy them everything that we never got to have, right? Yeah. There you go. Like, I mean, when I was in school, I had to walk in about 2 feet of snow every day, uphill both ways, you know. But here's the key. If our identity is all about making a name for ourselves, every evil comes from that. And it leads to separation, division, and confusion, as will be the case here in Genesis chapter 11. We've got to remind ourselves that God is set against human pride. Why is God against human pride? What's that? Because it comes from, that's a great reasoning. But simply because it poisons us. It leads us to make decisions we ought not to make. You go back to Cain and Abel. What was it that led Cain to kill his brother? It was pride. Murder, envy, quarreling, fighting, every evil thing finds its genesis where? In pride. But God desires our spirit, that He made in us. And what He desires is humility and a genuine desire to seek God instead of seeking our own way. So that's the rebellion. That's verses 1 through 4. Got any questions or comments you want to make about verses 1 through 4? Phil? Mm-hmm. And not really making bricks for their own selves, but for somebody else at this point, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Just spread it on. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But in their minds, they were doing what their pride told them was the thing to do, right? And pride leads to making poor decisions, foolish decisions. So what's going to be the response here? What is going to be the response? Let's look now and read Genesis chapter 11, beginning in verse 5. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. The Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language. And this is what they began to do, and now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they will not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore, its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth. Now, the first thing that I want you to notice, class, I want you to notice God's response to all these plans of humanity. The first thing that really stands out to me is the language here. Verse 5, what does it say? God has what? Come down to see the city and the tower. Class, humanity has not secured what they wanted. God is transcendent, right? Man tried to go up, and God comes down. God knows that what's happening here is just the beginning. If they continue at this trajectory and working together in this nature, whatever plans that they may devise in their own mind, they believe they can fulfill. The answer to this was to come down and confuse their language so that they might not be able to understand. And as a result of that, the people are dispersed over the face of the whole earth. So the question that we've got to answer here, why did God do this? First of all, let me make it very clear. Even if every man, woman, and child united on this earth for one common purpose, they could not and would not be able to overpower God. Do you know that? This is not a case where God is looking down and seeing this and saying, oh, if we don't put a stop to this, they are going to unite against me in such a fashion that they can be like me or overpower me. That's not what's going on here. This is God stepping in to save humanity from themselves. And folks, if you don't realize, by now, in this study of Genesis, that's what God has been doing throughout this book. Time and time again, God has had to step in to save humanity from themselves. And I can't help but it reminds me of when my kids were babies. How many times when your children were babies, they would do things to hurt themselves? Did you ever, it's going to be a quiz here. How many of you let your child touch the stove? You did? You just let them?
Well, we lived in Wisconsin and we had central heat. It was a big stove. And Jacob was in his walker and Dad said, I'm about to do something. Don't get upset. While it was just warm enough that Jacob could understand hot, he put his hand on it and said hot.
Okay.
Because that's the way my son had to learn.
I understand that. But most of us, if our son or daughter was about to reach up and touch the eye of the stove, we'd do what? We would say what? Stop, it's hot. But so many times kids don't learn until what? Until they actually touch it and, all right, that is hot, I'm not doing that again, right? I want you to, for just a moment, to consider Adam and Eve. With that command about the tree of life, the tree of good and evil, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, God knew that that tree was not good for humanity, right? It's the same thing that God did with Cain. It's the same thing that God did with the flood. These are all just the actions, the words of a loving and wise Heavenly Father that is making decisions for the benefit of creation. I've heard many times people in referencing this chapter go, well, this is God punishing mankind. How many of you have heard that? You know you have. Okay, you're welcome to look at it that way, but I'm telling you what I see here is God looking out for humanity. I see God doing us a big favor. We should read this, I think, similar to the way we've seen in previous instances, that these are natural consequences that by design guide humanity back to God. So, you might ask, Jonathan, if that's the way you really feel, then how does confusing our languages bring us back to God? Let me ask you this. Have you ever learned another language other than English? How many of you have learned multiple languages in your lifetime? This gibberish count. I started studying Greek in 1998. 98 and 99 took 2 years of Greek. 2000, 2001, 2 years of Hebrew. I wish I would have learned Spanish, but Spanish wasn't even offered in my high school. French was the only, I don't know why French, but French was the only language offered at my high school. This was 1995, so, you know. Let me tell you how I like to describe learning Greek, or even worse, Hebrew. Let me tell you what it's like. It's like you coming up to me after class and punching me in the face over and over and over again. That's what it's like to learn Greek and Hebrew. You just come out, just sock me in the face and the nose. Oh, it makes my eyes water. That's learning Greek and Hebrew. Because it's funny how I wish I retained more of it. I'm going to talk tonight in our lesson tonight about how Jews were trained. And some of what I'm going to tell you tonight is quite amazing to think about the routine for training Jews, younger Jews. But I had a professor at Heritage Christian University. His name was Jim Schmill. He taught me Greek. And we had to memorize the Gospel of John in Greek. The entire Gospel. Now, the hard thing about it is that the final exam, he would bring you in one at a time, and he would sit there at his desk, and you wouldn't know what part of the book he would ask you to recite. So you were just hoping it was one of the early chapters, because usually most of us guys, we did really good. Our discipline was really good at the beginning, but by the end of the book, you're kind of like, maybe he won't ask. And the worst feeling was when he would say, all right, you got one of these latter chapters. I did horribly. I mean, I was terrible at it. My mind I just couldn't do it. Thankfully, he still passed me. But it taught me a valuable lesson. So at the very core of learning a new language, one of the things it does is it humbles you. It humbles you. And when I think about this situation that we're witnessing here in Genesis chapter 11, all these new languages humbled them. It was a step in their humility. All right, we'll continue here next Lord's Day morning. Lord willing, we'll be back together. Please join us tonight at 6 p.m. We're going to look very thoroughly at the conversion to Christ of Saul, who became the Apostle Paul. I'd love to have you come be a part of that tonight at 6 p.m. Thank you.